Okay, what do you think of that? Oh boy. So all right, here we go. I think we're finally finding our way here. A little bit tricky to find this back alleyway. Apparently it's inside this garage, so get parked here and take a look. Holy crap, that is not what I expected. This is definitely a military truck if I've ever seen one. Kind of weird painted white. Whoa. I don't even know what that is. I'm gonna have to do a little bit of research here, but that's definitely unique. Not what I expected in the least. All right, so getting rolling on this thing. We've started to get things in position to work on it. So I don't know a lot of the details of the unit in particular as far as the parts, pieces, and the makeup of it, but it's definitely a military grade rig. Now a little bit of the backstory on this thing. A guy had it in storage for God knows how long, and he ended up losing his storage spot, and he took it into the local swap meet, and these guys picked it up quite a few years back. It sat outside for a while after that, but now it's here in the garage. So it hasn't run for God knows how long. A lot of the rubber hoses and everything are dry rotted. So we're gonna have to work through that. At least they did drain the radiator, so someone was looking to keep it around. Now apparently the rig only has 6,000 miles on it or so, and with the body on the thing and being here in Iowa, you know, you'd think that that's pretty accurate. It's in good shape from, you know, being from 63 or so. Obviously it was again repainted white, so I'm sure a lot of these went to surplus like this one, and if you can kind of see a washed out civil defense tag there. So who knows if a fire department used it or what, but definitely unique. You can see the original color was green here. You know, your standard military colors. So the parts and pieces are pretty rare for this guy, we're finding out. And this engine was set up to be completely waterproof, where it could go underwater. I mean, if you just look at these plug wires and everything, it's definitely beefy military stuff. Our fuel pump, and you know, I'm not even sure what this guy is down here. We'll just have to work through it. But this is a 230 Tornado engine. I'm not sure if this rig, or I guess this engine, was put into civilian models. I'd assume so, but definitely unique. So it is a 24 volt unit, and we are getting the batteries all set up to go in it, and to see if it will at least crank, make sure the engine isn't seized, so that we can work through that. But obviously all the terminals were all corroded out, so we're gonna get that rectified. We can't really get in there with a wrench to turn it over, so hopefully we can just bump the thing, and I assume since it was stored inside most of its life, it should be free. Some other interesting parts and pieces. This is literally the lock to the vehicle. The rest of everything else is just switches. There's technically no key, so that's kind of interesting. We're gonna have to look in the user's manual to figure out how to operate this rig with all the levers and what have you. So anyway, with that, when our parts come in here, we'll get jumping into this thing and working through it. Obviously parts are pretty darn scarce, a lot of new old stock, so this should be interesting. But as you see here, it's our favorite carburetor, the Holley unit. So good old Holley 1 barrel. So I'm confident if this thing cranks, we can make it do something. So let's jump right in. All right, so obviously an engine only needs about 4 things to run: fuel, air, spark, and compression. So if all of our engine internals are good, which I'm hopeful, then it really comes down to just getting air into the engine, fuel into the engine in the proper mixture, and then making sure we do have fire on our spark plugs and our ignition timing is accurate and correct. So the first thing we're going to obviously do is the carburetor sat for a long time, the ignition sat for a long time. we're gonna pull this guy off and test our coil out and all that like we normally do. Pull our carburetor off. We do have a new old stock rebuild kit for that, which is pretty neat. So we'll go ahead and work through that, guys. I'm sure the needle and seat and everything's all stuck on that guy. But just taking a look here, and we did source a owner's manual, I guess, to a degree, or a parts manual. And just look at this distributor. Super interesting. I'm assuming the coil is inside of this guy and it's got an O-ring. Everything to keep it nice and watertight. So someone was really thinking. They really had some good engineers on this in the day.
So I saw a guy one time, he added an electric, kind of put a Y on it, so he could electric prime it, and then once it was going, turned it off.
We got our 1-barrel carburetor off here, obviously, but just check out this alternator, or whatever you'd even want to call it. Triple pulley unit there, runs all the way up here, and has a cooler on the electrical lines and up into this massive voltage regulator. So super interesting. I think we're going to dial it back here and just go through everything nice and slow. I think we're going to get all our plugs out, get some tranny fluid down there, turn the crank over by hand, because this is just a really unique piece, and we want to make sure that we are sure not to damage everything, or at least take every precaution we can. So with that, anyway, I'm trying to get this last screw out. It's pretty darn tight. A lot of these pieces here have overhaul tags with a date code, which is super neat. So this thing was last touched, it looks like, in '74. Someone overhauled this guy, and the carburetor there, which we're going to jump into, it was last overhauled in the early '70s as well. So it's holding true with the story. It's 6,000 miles, and I'm hopeful that this will do something. So we'll soon find out. All right, so what seemed like after forever, we got this guy out of here. It was seized in, but we were able to get it out with a pair of vice grips without destroying our nifty little overhaul tag or ripping our threads out, so that's pretty good. So we're down to just our last screw here on our little cover that houses our coil and our distributor cap. So we're hopeful that it won't be all corroded from sitting and getting moisture in it, but the point of this guy here, as you can see, it has a seal, and it looks like everything's in pretty good shape, really. There's a little bit of corrosion from sitting, but not too bad. And our points look like they're not seized or corroded and stuck together, so we might be able to get away with this stuff, which is good because these parts are, again, super expensive. So we've cleaned up the terminals and replaced this guy over here so that we have good connection, and everything seems to be good. We went ahead and tested our coil out and got our multimeter here, and you've seen me do this many times before where we'll touch the positive lead. So let's flip the power on this guy. We finally figured out how to do that, and figuring out kind of some of the electrical routing. So there we go, everything came alive. This is the starter here, but again, I'll get to that in a moment. We don't want to go ahead and kick that over just yet. So now with a line ran to the negative of our battery and touching the positive terminal on our coil, we're getting 24 volts. So we're at least getting 24 volts up to our coil, and with how clean everything is and how free everything is, we still got our advance working on our distributor there. I'm pretty confident that we're going to have at least spark up to our spark plugs. All right, so testing the spark on our coil here. As you can see, we got 24 volts to our coil, our ground on our multimeter run back to our battery, and now we're going to see if our coil itself is any good. So with this weird orientation, usually I use a plug wire out of our discharge terminal on our coil, but instead we kind of, with this weird setup with this guy, we got to use a wire. So anyway, we're going up here to a spark plug sitting on the fuel pump because, you know, that's good and safe. And now if we put our piece of wire here on our ground on our coil and we go ahead and interrupt that ground, same as this is the same thing that your points essentially do. It opens and closes the ground. We can see our spark plug firing there, and it's pretty aggressive with this being a 24 volt unit, but looks like everything's good to go. At least our coil works, so we got good plug wires. I think we're going to be in good shape with our ignition. All right, so currently we're waiting for a couple sockets here to turn the crank and to pull a plug so we can verify that our coil and all that's in good shape. But right now we're working through the carburetor, and I'm pretty encouraged on the internals of the engine. As you see, it's not all rusted up, so there hasn't been a lot of moisture that's really gotten into this guy. Everything's free, and if you shake it around, you can hear that the float isn't seized, so it probably didn't sit with a bunch of gas. It got all varnished up. So we're going to jump into this guy and just make sure it's good, but I don't imagine we're going to come across anything too terrible inside here. All right, so we got our carburetor all good and disassembled, and we got our new old stock rebuild unit here, which is a pretty neat piece of nostalgia as well with the overhaul tag. But really, it looks all nice and clean inside the carburetor. It did sit with fuel, but it must have been from back in the day before there was alcohol in it, because it looks pretty good. Obviously we have some stuff to clean up here, but this just goes to show why we always pull apart the carburetor. Our little O-ring here that goes around our needle and seat assembly is completely petrified. Most of our diaphragms on our Holley style carburetor will be pretty destroyed at this point. So again, really, carburetor's pretty clean. That's pretty encouraging. Taking a look at our old needle and seat and our new needle and seat assembly, we can see that the threads aren't near as deep on our new assembly. So what we're going to do is use our new needle, and we got a new O-ring and our little seated aluminum gasket here. So we're going to go ahead and run that in now. We just didn't have enough threads on our other unit. Now, another thing that's interesting about this carburetor in particular is it uses one of these foam style floats. Now, the issue with these is they do not hold up to alcohol in the gasoline. You have to use non-ethanol based gasoline, or else they'll completely melt. So currently I think we'll probably end up taking a look to see if we can source a brass one of these guys, but for now this is what we have, so we're going to put it back in there. But in this current configuration, we really wouldn't be able to use ethanol, because again, it would just melt that float in a hurry. So we couldn't find any chapstick, which usually I use, but I guess there was some lip gloss around in a car, so not mine, mind you, that we're going to go ahead and put on here. So if we ever do pull this float bowl off again, our gasket's not going to stick on one side or the other, and hopefully, you know, we can pull our float bowl off a few times before it completely would destroy our gasket. So it should give us a little bit more longevity out of it. Alright, so working down here on the crank, we finally got a socket that'll fit in here and dodge our radiator shroud. One interesting piece, if I haven't mentioned it yet, is, you know, they really overbuilt everything on these military rigs. So they have this little retaining plate on here so that this crank bolt couldn't walk itself out, which is pretty cool. But Now, kind of the issue is the crank itself. I can't get it to turn. We went up and messed with it. Welcome to Elkhart, right? Couldn't get the crank to turn. I went up and I messed with the water pump. I messed with the alternator, and it really seems like the engine is potentially stuck. So it's just really not wanting to move. So I don't know what we're going to do here. Got an interesting noise in the back of this guy when we turn the engine clockwise. Kind of interesting, but so far we're about halfway around. It's kind of a pain here as we got some nice clearance issues, so we can only go, you know, so far before we have to pop our wrench off and start again. But haven't felt any more. You know, it's not really grabbing anywhere, so far so good once it's been broke free.
Tell us, honey, what did they tell you at Napa?
She doesn't want any part of it. How many different sizes did they have? They had at least 2.
There was 3 different manufacturers that had stuff.
All different lengths and orientations, I'm sure. So yeah, it would be good to have one out of the thing. It's definitely tight. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the original one with only 6,000 miles. That is the coolest breaker bar I've ever seen. Why is that not more popular?
Because then Snap-on can't sell you an extension.
There's probably a lot of truth to that. That's definitely a unique looking plug, isn't it? The good thing we're seeing is there's not any rust on the tip that would protrude into the engine, so it doesn't look like there was a whole lot of moisture at all that got in there. Look how clean that watertight piece of the plug was. Obviously, that must have worked pretty good in the day. Alright, so since we've never seen the vehicle run and these plug wires are super expensive, normally we just go ahead and replace them, but being almost $300 a set, being this watertight set, which you'll probably never see another setup like this unless you're working on a military vehicle, we're just going through making sure they all ohm out so there's no breaks in them, and so far so good. This is our last one here. And it looks like all of these are returning relatively a consistent ohm rating. So I'm pretty confident that these will be good enough to run our engine and we won't have to get new ones. So these guys should be just fine for us. So here's just a closer look at our watertight plug here. So it just goes right on inside. This nut slides up. Tightens her down, you know, until it locks in, and there you go. Like I said, pretty interesting unit. You're not going to find that in too many other places. So we pulled the plugs out of here and they actually all looked pretty good. Usually when you have moisture down the cylinder, your spark plug tip will have a little bit of rust on it as well, but I didn't see that on this guy, so I'm pretty encouraged. But all the same, we're just gonna take a little bit of extra caution here. It's not as common of an engine as like a small block Ford. So right now we're just making do with what we got for a funnel and running some of this tranny fluid down here to hopefully, you know, if there is anything sticking in the cylinders, hopefully this will help to free it up. And if nothing else, you know, this engine's sat for a long time, so the extra little bit of lubrication on its first fire up really isn't going to hurt anything. So Right now, you know, we don't put a lot in, just enough to get some in there. Then we'll rotate the engine around quite a few times. So it definitely must have been the clutch plate or something hanging up on this guy. As you can see just how free it is. You can turn it over by hand now with the plugs out of it. I don't smash my hand off in there. Steve's down here working away at the oil pan and get the oil out of the thing. I can't imagine it's had the oil changed too much in its life here with only having the mileage it has. What's the oil look like? Kind of sludgy.
It's very, very thick.
Was it pretty clean? Well,
Not too bad.
yeah, has a magnetic drain plug. Looks pretty good. It's not all, you know, like it's got any rust or any weird stuff on it. Kind of an interesting valve cover here. The center bolt style goes around, and we do have another valve cover gasket for it. This one's all petrified, and with the design it's probably a good idea that we change that, because I'm sure if we would start it, it would just pour oil, as you can see. So, alright, so getting the valve cover off. Try and lift it as straight off as possible, not turn the valve cover and drop the dirt all in. And come on. There we go. Pretty cool design on these where they use, it looks like the same cam lobe for opposing valves. Overall it looks like everything's pretty good. It's not all rusted up. It even looks like it has what almost appears to be fresh oil relatively at the top of the engine. So really there hasn't been a lot of moisture that's got in here, which we were pretty encouraged by the carburetor originally as well. You know, it wasn't all rusted up. Everything looks pretty good. This looks like something with our fuel pump eccentric here. The timing chain feels good and tight, which makes me feel very confident about our mileage. So that's pretty awesome. So finishing up, having a look at our valve train here, it seems that all of our valves are opening. Poor Steve is down there cranking away, turning the engine over, but everything looks pretty good. And again, just another look at this camshaft. Obviously, one lobe runs the intake and exhaust valve on each cylinder. So, you know, this is pretty unique. Usually you didn't see overhead cam stuff start hitting the scene until much later. You know, this being a 60s vehicle, really that wasn't popularized until, you know, the 80s and fuel injection era stuff. So this is pretty unique. Another unique piece is these are actually solid lifters. As you can see, obviously the cam lobe directly contacts the rocker arm, and that directly contacts the valve stem. So we might go through and have a look at our valve train, but just going through everything, nothing is exceedingly loose. It looks and feels all to be pretty within spec, at least to the point where it's gonna run and not cause any issues. But we're looking really good here. The fuel pump eccentric isn't stuck, so that's good. We got a diaphragm for that we're going to go ahead and throw on there, since all of our plastic and rubber stuff is pretty petrified at this point. But moving right along here, I'm very confident with our engine internals, so very happy to see this. So we're just working through changing the oil here, and it's pretty interesting pulling the oil filter off, you know, giving further credence to the fact that it probably does only have 6,000 miles or so. That's definitely a throwback oil filter that I'm not familiar with. Now, since we're on the topic of oil, I'm taking a look here again at our valve train. You can see that this is what's called a flat tappet valve train design. So most modern cars run an overhead cam, a roller design, and basically it lessens your friction between your metal to metal pieces. So in doing that, they've pulled what's called zinc out of motor oil, and really the point of zinc is to soften the blow and kind of create a sacrificial layer between these metal to metal parts and pieces that are commonly found in older vehicles. Now with our zinc oil additive here, we've also gone ahead and picked up some of this lead substitute. So I'm not sure on this particular engine, but a lot of engines back in the 60s were manufactured without hardened valve seats because they had lead in the gasoline, and so you really didn't need it. But as they went through, they went to unleaded fuel, and that's what we all run today. And basically, if you don't have hardened valve seats, what that would do is the surface where your exhaust valve would meet its seat on the inside your chamber here on the cylinder head, it would basically wear that away, and you know, you'd have some valve train failures as we went through. So I'm not sure on this particular engine, but assuming because it's from 1967 or so, we're just not going to take any chances here, and we're going to go ahead and add in a lead substitute. Now we're cooking right along. This thing was probably not going to last a whole lot longer. You can see it was completely petrified on the outside, and a few heat cycles, and I'm sure it would have been all cracked up on the inside as well. A pretty modern piece there, really. You know, that's how we do everything now, but back then most of it was cork. I'm sure they went to great lengths to make this all good and watertight. So we've done this about, luckily we only did it a couple times before we got smart and did it right, but obviously this is probably a new old stock gasket, and maybe they were more pliable back in the day, but being a rubber piece, it either shrunk or it's designed to be pretty tight. But it really worked out for us after we did it wrong the first time to run all of this on here first, and then have this nice straight run to do our stretch to get it across. Because the first time we ended over here and it was like, man, our gasket's like way too short. But in doing all this and taking out all the slack here, we were able to get that on. But definitely that was a unique experience that you know, there's probably a better way to do it than how we did it, but she's on there and ready to go back on. Ta-da, there we go. So getting ready to put oil in the engine here. We got some 1030, and we're just going to go ahead and put our zinc additive directly into our motor oil so that we can shake that up and get that good and blended before we put it in the engine. But on these vehicles that sit for a long time, what seems like I find more often than not is the thermostat is rusted and stuck in place, and that's about the last thing we want to have happen when we go to fire this thing up. We don't want it to overheat or anything of that nature. So Steve pounded away here and was able to get this thermostat housing off. It's kind of a son of a gun with this 3-stud design here, and you can see why. It's pretty rusted up, so I'm not sure. We might have to take this whole deal off and pull it off from the back. All right, so taking a look at our thermostat, it's definitely kind of a unique design. It was seized in here pretty good, but we just put a screwdriver right on our end here and tapped it around. It's gonna make a liar out of me. There we go. And loosen that guy right up. And it seems like this one wasn't seized. Interestingly enough, we do have coolant hanging down there in the block, but you know, maybe boil that and see if that still works. They are kind of a rare piece, I'm sure. But we do have a new one here, and it's labeled towards radiator, so we can't stick that on backwards. It looks like it fits and our new gasket fits. So coolant in here looks pretty good and green. It doesn't look like it's all kind of gone acidic on us too bad. So hopefully our radiator's good. We'll soon find out, but we'll get this all buttoned back up with our new gasket, and I think we'll be good to go here. So right now we're filling up the cooling system. We got some 50-50 here, and basically I got my thermostat housing bolts still loose. Reason being is I want to be able to burp the air out of the engine. Now if you've ever dropped in a new engine and just filled the radiator and had a sealed cooling system, you're probably fighting your temperature running away on you when you were trying to run that engine. And reason being really that you get an air bubble trapped up in the engine. You really don't want to do that. You don't want to burn anything up. All right, so now we got the cooling system filled to the point where coolant is coming out of our thermostat housing, so we know that at the very top level of our block we are completely full of coolant. We're not going to have any hot spots, so now we can bolt this down and continue to fill up our radiator and be confident that we're in good shape. What's the one that I definitely fail at?
Is properly dressed.
That's awesome. And what are those?
The rules to be a good driver.
I guess I'm not a good driver.
Rule number 1, does not have accidents.
What? I'm not sure what that means.
Is proud of his record and his vehicle.
Hey.
Well, you got one.
We got the battery hooked up, new oil and everything, the coolant's in it. I think it's good enough to just bump the starter and see if our starter's in good shape. All right, so bumping this thing over, we're actually testing out a lot of stuff here. Making sure the clutch is loose. I think that's neutral. So if I can remember right, we have ignition. There we go. Looks like our battery voltage came up, and our starter is actually this little foot switch. Get our old radio out of the way. Now, some of you commented that there's more pieces to this, and it is indeed behind the passenger seat. So that's a pretty cool unit there. Old Motorola walkie-talkie setup. So anyway, we're just going to lightly bump this. And I think our switch might be rusted in place here. All right, so I think we finally got this figured out here after tapping around on our switch. It looks like everything's in good shape. So with our clutch in here, it seems like when I press on it with my foot, I don't get the best angle, but if I use my thumb, it's gonna make a liar out of me again. There we go. Howdy my friends, and welcome to the channel. Today I'm Luke, Thunderhead289 here on YouTube, and today we're tying up some loose ends. So I'd worked on this, shoot, I don't even remember what it is. I think it's a 67 Jeep Gladiator. So anyway, we're finally back at it, and we're gonna get it all wrapped up today and finally fire off the engine for the first time. Now this is an old military vehicle, obviously, and then it was painted white by the Department of Defense or whatever. It has tagged on the side of it in a few places. So it spent most of its time on a military base or whatever. And so there's only 6,000 miles on the odometer, and I remember from having the valve cover off just how clean the engine was and everything. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's the original mileage. So we've done some work on it already, but for today, I think we're just at the point of wrapping this thing up and firing it off. It's funny, that's where we left off 2 years ago, but you know, sometimes life gets in the way. So with that, let's jump right in. Looking forward to finally firing off that engine. I know I rebuilt the carburetor and some other things, and so I'm thinking today it shouldn't take a whole lot. Button up the ignition and get some fuel to it, and we should be good to go. All right, so I had to take a moment here to for us to collect ourselves and just see what was what and where we were. And I think at this point, the cylinders were last filled with transmission fluid. There was kind of a sticky spot there. So we let that sit, and we were gonna let it sit for, I don't know, a month or so, but I think it's been a couple years at this point. So anyway, that should be all good to go. We're at the point where we need to roll the engine over and sling that transmission fluid out of the cylinders if there's any still there. And then other than that, I think it took our ignition up and the thing should fire off. I've taken a moment to lay a tarp over here so we don't cover the inner fender well all with oil if that transmission fluid does shoot out of the spark plug holes. And then we have an auxiliary fuel system temporarily rigged up so that when we do get to the point of firing the vehicle up here, we don't have to crank it for a long time to get any fuel up to the carb. So with that, I think we are good to roll the engine over. Well, before we spin it over with the starter, just wanted to roll the engine over by hand. I do remember it turned pretty okay. I haven't felt that sticky spot now with all the lube in the cylinders, but it's looking pretty good. All right, so the batteries are all hooked up here. As you notice, there's absolutely no key. The locking system originally is just where you lock the steering wheel So that's kind of unique. But anyway, it should have power right now. The battery indicator's showing low. We'll try and spin the starter. It's this little push button on the floor. I think we're in neutral. Go ahead and push the clutch in anyhow. Engine seems to roll over clean. Slinging anything out up there?
Nope. All right.
Not throwing any oil out?
Not yet.
So one interesting thing about this this rig here is all of this stuff is super watertight, so it's really hard to come by. So we're going to try and make do with some of the original spark plugs. Some of them at whatever point were changed out for normal ones, but those are kind of hard to work with, and we can get a, you know, ground out not through the spark plug and some weird stuff there. So Steve was able to find some of these original style, which is pretty awesome. So we're just getting all those gapped up. But I mean, this stuff is really interesting. I'm sure I touched on it in one of the previous videos here, but it's all watertight. The coil is actually built into the distributor. You know, they have these watertight spark plug leads that screw in, you know, and I remember ohming these out, so these were all good because they're super, super rare. But I don't know if this was like what they intended to do with this. Was this an amphibious vehicle? Were they going to go underwater? It dang near looks like they could. You know, obviously that wasn't the intent, but being military, you know, it seems like they were just trying to be prepared for whatever situation. Definitely a pretty stout setup. So the one thing that I'll probably be looking for here if we fire it up and we do have a minor misfire is I'm just a little suspicious of how these spark plug wires make contact with the spark plugs themselves. They're a little tarnished down inside where they touch on some of the older ones, and we weren't able to come up with a full set of new ones. So, you know, cross our fingers here that those make good contact, but if there is a little bit of a bobble in the idle or anything, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if these old spark plugs are the culprit. Alright, so getting our cap on here, and like I said, it's very interesting. The coil is actually part of the distributor itself, and everything is, again, watertight. The only casualty we had, I think, from this being 2 years until we got back to it is we lost the screws that went in here, which is a shame to some degrees. There was a really cool rebuild tag or inspection tag from 71 or something, I remember, but we're able to pick some up at the hardware store, so that's not slowing us down today. But I think with that, we're going to get our ignition lead hooked up here that I had disconnected for rolling the engine over. If you ever spin an engine over and you don't want to have, and you have your spark plugs out or whatever, you always want to unhook your ignition coil, because if you're still supplying power to that coil, it's going to want to ground somewhere, and it can ground inside of itself and just ruin your coil. And considering that this is a special one, even though we have another one, you know, we just didn't want to do that. All right, so at this point we have all the ignition all hooked up, and we're just going to prime our carburetor up so we can minimize our crank time before we get fuel to the engine here. So we have our auxiliary fuel system all set up. We don't want to pull from the tank. Well, the tank's not actually in it anymore. So it had a pretty unique diaphragm style mechanical pump, but for the moment we're just going to bypass all that. So we have our super Chinesium 1000 level fuel pump here that's like $12 off of Amazon, and a little fuel pressure gauge. Thank you, my friend. I think she's going. Got an equally cheap little pressure gauge on it. So it looks like we're holding 5 psi. Nothing is coming out of the vent tube, so our needle and seat are functional. Work our throttle here. Sounds like there's a functional accelerator pump. I think we can try and roll it over. Don't know if we do have spark. All right, take two here. Steve got the best of me, and he pointed out that our gauge, our battery gauge that we were looking at, you know, when I hooked the battery up, the switch was apparently already on, which I should have noticed, because then, you know, I flipped it this direction. I was like, okay, now we're good to go, you know, and you can see right on our gauge here that it's reading a solid nothing. So now, ta-da, you know, it makes sense. We have voltage. So really, give it a few pumps here. Maybe push in the clutch so we don't run over the chicken coop out in front. It is running, oil pressure is coming up. Oil pressure is pretty good. It's below 60 there. Try and let up off the clutch. All right, how about that? And we're not even on fire yet. Hey, it just takes turning the switch the right way. Imagine that.
Good job.
And it's idling. Check that out. The vacuum is super steady. And actually this gauge, when it's off, is well below zero, you know, by probably a couple inches of mercury. So it's probably making over 20 inches of vacuum, nice and steady, so all the valve train is extremely healthy. Sounds quiet. You said there's no exhaust on it, Steve?
Exhaust pipe is
You just purrs. It's a super quiet engine. That was almost too easy. Alright, every once in a while I can hear it kind of puff, like it just misfires a little bit. It's a little bit lean. The adjustment for the mix screw is actually all the way back and under here. Quite a deal. There we go. See how the vacuum came up and it almost smoothed out? We just gave it another quarter turn. That's pretty good. We'll just give it a little bit more. Well, I think that's good. Hear how the exhaust kind of cleaned up? All right, so by all rights, we didn't think we would get this far today where the thing actually moved, considering the wheels were completely seized, but we're able to feather the clutch a little bit and break them free. They still have a little bit of drag, but we might try and just put it down the road here. So we're rigging up a auxiliary gas can and getting our fuel pump all moved, and in classic form, you know, hanging right out the side of the front of the vehicle. But I think it's actually going to putt down the road in the first time in forever. Okay, what do you think of that? Oh boy. So we can't use the batteries because they're 24 volt. Maybe we could, I don't know, but might burn up the pump. So we have the jump pack running the fuel pump, and see, we want to do the wrong thing, of course, the right way. So our fuel pump is below our gas tank and being gravity fed. So yeah, let's pull it out of the garage. There's nothing wrong with this. This is totally legal. So it has absolutely no brakes, but it's very self-braking. As soon as you push the clutch in, you roll to a stop pretty quick. This is something special. I'm a little too tall to drive this. Work the clutch. Okay. This must be a granny low, maybe. I try and grab a second.
No, you just keep going straight. Through the stop sign.
And the wheel's freed up. All right, well there it is, up and running. What do you think, Steve?
I think it's wonderful. Now comes the fun part. Get some brakes down, get her cleaned up, get her painted. That's fun.
Yeah. Probably wouldn't hurt to have a new fuel system on it.
Fuel tank's been coated. It's ready to go. We need to check the sending unit. Hopefully our combination fuel pump vacuum wiper unit is functional. So we'll find that out once we get it plumbed up. We made great headway, and good to finally hear it come to life.
Yeah, for sure. Very exciting. Sounds pretty healthy though. Valve train is quiet, has good oil pressure. It's not overheating or even trying to overheat one bit. It's just a pretty solid old rig. Probably does have the original 6,000 miles on it. Awesome.